Hey guys, it's Miss Bastido here. We're here doing our last video over Unit 3. And so this video will be over ecological succession. And hopefully it won't be too long, but here we go. Let's just jump right in. So if you've already covered it a little bit in class, you might remember that ecological succession is just a series of changes that happens in an ecosystem over time. And so we can predict what these changes might be based on evidence from the past, which we'll talk about later on in the video. And so this is an example of a forest. So maybe the forest had a forest fire, or maybe there was deforestation. And so there'll be some initial species that show up, and then over time, you might have some dominant species after a little while. Like some shrubs, and some smaller trees. And then over time, you end up with these very large trees in this forest, and we call that the climax community. So this progression, we would say, always starts with a pioneer species. So we'll talk about the difference between primary and secondary succession in a moment, but whether the species is whether the succession is primary or secondary, there are always some sort of pioneer species that enter the area. And so those pioneer species, in some cases, would be lichens. I know in my class we've studied lichens a bit, but they are usually mutualistic relationship between two species. So they're actually not a species themselves, but they would be considered a pioneer species. Mosses, maybe some smaller grasses, depending on what type of succession we're doing. So we always call the first species to inhabit the area the pioneer species. And then, eventually what happens is we start off with some smaller, plants, and then maybe some shrubs, and then we end up with a climax community at the end. There are two types of succession, and so there's primary succession and secondary succession. You'd probably be more familiar with secondary succession, and this is when we start with soil. So if there's soil present at the site, then this is secondary succession. Now, secondary succession can start in multiple places depending on our phases, depending on what has happened in the area, but it's usually due to some kind of disturbance such as deforestation or a forest fire or something like that where there is soil at the start. And so you can see a picture of that there. Primary succession is when there is no soil at the start. So we're talking maybe a glacier retreating or a lava flow has occurred. So there's no soil to start off with. And so our first species that inhabit this are always lichen. And these lichen, you don't have to know this for this class, but these lichen over time actually form the soil as they grow, decay. They'll actually will start the formation of soil, which takes, so clearly primary succession is going to take much, much longer than that secondary succession. So we'll talk about the primary succession first. And so we really have an area where there's bare rock. There's no real life in the area. And so the first inhabitants, that pioneer species that we talked about, is going to be those mosses and the lichen, and they're going to grow on the bare rock. Over time, they're going to die, and they're going to end up forming the soil. Once the soil develops, now you're going to start having grasses and smaller, maybe weeds or plants. And then as the soil gets thicker and thicker, the soil's then able to support shrubs, and then eventually trees will start to grow. Again, this could be after a lava flow or a volcanic eruption or a glacial retreat, somewhere where there's no soil. This is going to progress quite slowly, especially this first phase, as it takes a really long time for that soil to develop. In secondary succession, we're still in primary succession. In primary succession, this pioneer species, you can see here, it's kind of giving you an idea of how long this would take. And so you start with bare rock, you end up with lichens, those small plants, maybe some herbs and grasses, and then we'll have shrubs and maybe some trees that are intolerant to shade will form. So maybe some smaller trees, And those are the intermediate sort of species that occur. And then we end up with these very large trees in the climax community. Obviously, this all depends on what ecosystem you're in. If you're not in an ecosystem that would have been forested, then you might not end up at this. This might not be the climax community. But in a forest, like this is how this might go. And some of the species here in the intermediate phase might have shown up here, and then they might disappear here once climax community is reached. And so that's something to take note that could happen. In secondary succession, there's been a disturbance, usually by humans or by a natural disaster. So this could be like a bushfire or clearing of land, clearing of land for agriculture. Things like that would cause secondary succession to occur. This is typically happens way more quickly than primary succession because the formation of soil doesn't have to occur. So soil has already formed. So in a eucalypt forest, this might happen in just maybe 10 years. Whereas the cold boreal forest, this could take up to 100 years. So it really does depend on where you are as to how long this would take. Secondary succession, we don't have to think about the whole area. That secondary succession is happening in forest all the time. So if a tree falls in the rainforest, that area where the tree has fallen, and there's a large amount of light at the bottom, now that area individually is doing secondary succession in that area. So there'll be grasses, and then there'll be shrubs, and then there'll be trees, and then eventually the canopy will reform in the rainforest. So this can happen if you've seen any abandoned farmland, that you'll see the grasses are growing. We have one across from our farm that they've stopped farming, and so that those grasses are growing, and there's some shrubs that are growing, and so over time those trees will come back if given the opportunity to do that. So here's a picture of that here. So here we have, there was a forest fire here, and after about a year, there's some annual plants. Now, sometimes the trees aren't completely burned. Depending on what kind of forest it is, they might actually survive and be able to reform. And so in that case, they're probably starting somewhere over here. But if all the trees die in this forest fire, then we might see annual plants first, then some grasses, then some shrubs, then maybe some deciduous, some coniferous trees like pine trees, and then eventually maybe some deciduous trees. Obviously, this really changes in Queensland when we think about that a lot of the trees aren't deciduous at all. And so these intermediate species could also be some of the same mature species that are here. So in order to be a pioneer species, we need to think about what characteristics do they need, because there's nothing else living in the area. So what do they have to be able to do? Well, one is that they have to be able to live in some pretty harsh conditions. They have to be able to fix nitrogen on their own. They need to be able to germinate quickly, and they have to be able to photosynthesize. If they can't photosynthesize, they have nothing to eat. So the first species that arrive cannot depend on another organism for food. And so these pioneer species, like the lichen and the mosses, have ability to do photosynthesis. And in the case of the lichen, it's a bacteria and a fungus, so that bacteria is able to do photosynthesis. And so they should be able to germinate quickly, meaning that they'll also reproduce quickly, and they just should be able to fix nitrogen on their own. They cannot depend on soil to do that because there is no soil present. And again, the common species here are lichens, where we have algae and a fungus living together in a symbiotic relationship, mosses, which are plants, and then cyanobacteria, which are bacteria that photosynthesize. So in all three cases, we have something that's photosynthesizing. So that's generally what we think about when we think about succession. And so you can really Even at your school where they're mowing the lawn, that every time they mow the lawn, they've started secondary succession has gone back. If they were to stop mowing the lawn, like what would happen in that area? So you'd have the grass grow, but then you might have some shrubs grow, and then you might have some taller trees grow if you let it go for long enough. One of the things that we can interpret past environments and look at the fossil record to really see what kind of successional changes occurred in the past. And so this is kind of a really simple diagram, but it just shows that here there was a layer of volcanic ash. And so what happened was there initially was no evidence of fossils here. And that's because in this time period, that's probably when those pioneer species showed up. And when that succession, that primary succession or secondary succession was taking place, depending on whether there was soil present or not. So we can predict, we can actually use this to predict what might happen in the future if that same sort of event occurred. And so we can see what happened biotic and abiotic. So we can see here how the soil was forming. And then we can see here that finally we have some species present here. So we can also make some predictions about what might happen in the future based on what's happened in the past. And so here's, they've taken pollen samples through the depth of this lake bed in North Queensland, which is now in a place that's a rainforest. So this is current time and this is past. And also some evidence of that there's that the species richness here was quite low when we were in a different kind of forest. So it used to be a woodland with herbs, and used to be quite a bit drier, more forest fires. So we can make predictions if these things start increasing in number in those areas. So if this woodland forest here, which is the brown, if it starts increasing, if we were to zoom in here, we could see that there has been a slight increase in those species. And so we would predict that that would increase the chance of forest fires, which then will decrease the species richness here. So we can make some predictions about that the past is an indicator of the future, that if these sorts of rainforest species or these angiosperms start to decrease in number, that could have an effect on the succession and what the succession would look like in this area. And then our last section here is about human impacts on succession. So we really need to think about, when we think about succession, that most successional changes are occurring due to human impact currently. So I gave a few examples here, but obviously some of them are more obvious than others. So deforestation, for instance, changes how a forest is able to come back. So if it takes a really long time, and if we're tearing down the trees faster than they can replenish themselves, that we're obviously changing what the succession might look like and how often that successional change might occur in this area. In the case of farming, we are constantly interrupting succession of the area. And we think about cane farms in particular, that they're located in areas that are in a lot of areas, not all areas, but that in a lot of areas that were once pretty forested. And so just planting that cane every year is contributing to the successional change of that area, and sort of stopping the advancement of the succession in the area. And then one thing we don't really think about, but when we burn fossil fuels, that contributing to climate change is affecting the succession of a lot of species, because it's changing the climate of the area, and changing the climate could change what species are able to be present, and that might actually change what could happen in the future in those areas. We think about that when we think about coral reefs, things like that, that we are changing how they might be able to do succession due to the warming temperatures of the water and the acidity of the water, and not being able, and the mass bleaching events that are occurring more often, and the more often that they occur, the less chance that coral reef is going to recover in a timely manner. So just thinking about how we might impact succession is something important to think think about. There's other examples. These were just a few examples. So hopefully that helped you understand succession a little bit better. If you have any questions, you can comment below, or feel free to just ask me in class.